Hello, this is the second of my videos on my paper, Social Media and the Public Sphere, the example of printing. So in the first video we covered the importance of modern social media, the development of European print culture, and Renaissance, Reformation, and institutions of control. And today we'll move on to the printing regimes in Holland and England and look briefly at two of the particular movements that illustrate this development, the scientific revolution and the 17th century debates on economic questions. And then in the next video we'll move on to political movements and some concluding comments. So to pick up points made in the earlier video, the spread of printing in Europe resulted in an easier flow of new and sometimes controversial ideas. There were both international and national attempts to control these developments, with some countries like Spain and Portugal being able to prevent the entry of unwanted books. This led to differences in what I have termed printing regimes. I'm not quite sure whether I've invented that term or whether I've unwittingly borrowed it from someone else. So now let's go back to the paper. Thus, within Europe, marked differences emerged between different states, a division developing between those countries in which authors were relatively free to publish what they wanted, and those in which they were not, and in which printing was tightly controlled, and the mere possession of a banned book might lead to severe punishments. Notably, the three countries with the freest publishing regimes, initially and very briefly the Venetian Republic, later the Dutch Republic and England, were also the main centres of the developing capitalist world economy, a correlation which strongly supports Habermas's notion of a link between capitalism and the developing public sphere, which I'll come back to. The two countries where there was eventually an effective lack of control of printing were Holland and England. In these two countries, internal religious and political divisions persisted, leading to recurrent public debates and the circulation of contentious pamphlets and books supporting one faction or another. Despite major differences between the two states, the end results were similar: a grudging acceptance of religious diversity and comparatively free printing regimes. The acceptance came later in England than in Holland. Also of note was the situation of the initially very large French Protestant minority, the Calvinist Huguenots, initially in contention for power in the French state and later a severely persecuted group in their homeland. Many of their members fled their country for their lives, the Huguenots developing an early love for religious freedom and an antipathy towards state absolutism, which was eloquently expressed by some of their authors. Unsurprisingly, Holland and England became two of the most common refuges for the Huguenot exiles. Venice initially became the major printing centre for the whole of Europe, and by 1500 was home to some 150 printing presses, which had between them produced more than 4,000 editions and approximately 1/7 of all the books that had then been printed across the continent up to that date. Printing in Venice soon came under the control and restriction of the Inquisition, however, and it was Protestant Holland and England which took a different trajectory. I made a video on this already, I'll put a link below. So the Dutch Republic. Already by the early 17th century, controls on publishing in Holland were often ineffective and comparatively light. Books were sometimes banned and printed material destroyed, and printers were sometimes fined and even imprisoned, but the complex federal structure of the Republic meant that the banning of a work in one town did not prevent its publication elsewhere, and religious and political divides between the literary partisans of different groups of Calvinists and between the supporters and opponents of the Princes of Orange meant that there was often a plethora of mutually contradictory published voices, and hardly ever a unified official voice on matters of thought. Amsterdam, in particular, became home to those willing to publish challenging and unconventional material, and a large number of competing print shops made it easier to find a publisher. By 1675, it was home to over half the Republic's 203 printing presses, and there were at least 230 booksellers and printers doing business in the city between 1680 and 1710. With more controversial works, most famously perhaps the works of the philosopher Benedict Spinoza, it was also possible to publish without a printer's name. Amsterdam also became a centre for printing in French by émigré Huguenots, a sign of the continued internationality of printing, and a means by which French books could be published free from France's more rigorous censorship and then smuggled across the borders. These are two of the most eminent philosophers of the time who both lived and published in the Dutch Republic. On the left we have Benedict Spinoza, the philosopher, and on the right Pierre Bayle, one of the leading French Calvinist intellectuals. Now let's turn to England, which is a more complex situation. The situation in England is notable for the fairly rapid transition from one of the most restrictive printing regimes in Europe to one of the most liberal. In the 13th century, the official edict, and I'm going to try my Latin now, De Scandalis Magnatum from 1275, had prohibited the dissemination of false news or opinions that might cause the growth of discord between the king and the people, and those accused could be tried and punished without warrant or normal legal process. This law was applied to printed material after the introduction of printing in 1476, and by 1585 pre-publication restriction was also obtained introduced, such that anyone who wanted to print a book was required to obtain a license. A further licensing act in 1637 limited the number of printers, thereby ensuring that only government-approved printers could produce books or other printed material. Punishment for publishing material that was deemed critical of those in power could be severe, as in the case of the radical Puritan writer William Prynne in 1637, who was eventually sentenced to a massive fine, imprisonment, and mutilation. Parts of his ears were cut off, and he was branded on the cheeks with the letters S and L, signifying seditious libeller. The situation of publishing changed dramatically during the period of the Civil War, followed by the interregnum. Initially, the contestation for power led the partisans of rival political and religious factions to engage in a massive war of pamphlets to promote their respective positions. The period also saw the publication of several major controversial books, notably John Milton's Areopagitica, in which he attacked the pre-publication censorship of printed material in general as tyrannical, and Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan with its secular political philosophy. The restoration of the monarchy under Charles II in 1660 led to the reintroduction of controls on publishing, but the establishment of constitutional monarchy under William and Mary in 1688-89 and the passing of the Bill of Rights in 1689 marked the commencement of a more liberal era, and the lapsing of the English licensing laws in 1695 signalled the beginning of what proved to be a revolution in English publishing, with large numbers of new books, pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals streaming off the presses even by the earliest decades of the 18th century, with an excess of 300,000 book and pamphlet titles published by 1800 already, amounting perhaps to 200 million copies. These are the two authors I just mentioned. On the left we have John Milton, and on the right Hobbes. So both of these were very, very controversial works at the time of publication. In both Holland and England, then, printing contributed to the emergence of a Habermasian public sphere. For Habermas, the public sphere was an important element in the development of early modern European society. It constituted a discursive space separate from both the sphere of public authority embodied in government and state institutions and the private sphere of people's private lives, of family, friends, and daily life. In it, private people came together as a public and were able to openly discuss matters of public concern and generate public debate and opinion. Such openness contrasted sharply with the closed and elitist nature of the discussion of public issues that was characteristic of most traditional societies, and was linked to the emergence of the liberal capitalist societies of the period and the forceful efforts of the bourgeoisie to gain a voice regarding those issues that were of relevance to them, and if possible to influence them. I'll put a link to a video I made on Habermas's public sphere. For both the Dutch and English, public debate became increasingly regarded as normal, a characteristic which marked off these societies from most of those of early modern Europe. Note that in both cases, other factors besides the development of printing were involved, however, including ongoing religious and political divisions and debates, with divisions within influential elites being particularly important, the development of forms of representative government, the decentralized nature of much of Dutch decision-making, and the inability of English governments to impose lasting controls on the printing industry. Also of major importance in England after the Civil War was the rapid spread of coffee houses, particularly in London, where there were over 500 recognized coffee houses by the 1730s, more than any other European city apart from Istanbul. Significantly, whilst the government of Charles II, from 1660 to 1685, identified coffee houses as subversive institutions in which free political debate and discussion might occur, it failed to have them closed down in the face of popular opposition. Again, I've done a video on coffee houses, so I guess I should put the link to that as well. Now let me turn to some of the major intellectual and political movements of the 17th century, which were heavily impacted by the spread of print culture and the emergence of a public sphere of discourse. Printing had a transformative role in intellectual and popular debate, and outside of the more contentious worlds of religious and political argument, we can see good examples of this in two major intellectual movements of this period: the elitist networks of the scientific revolution, which reached maturity at this time, and the various debates on economic policy, which raged, most particularly in England. In religion and politics, intricately interconnected during this period, we can again refer to developments in England, but I'll leave that for the next video. In the popular imagination, the scientific revolution is best known for the great innovative ideas of the individual pioneers of modern science. These began with earlier thinkers such as Nicholas Copernicus and Galileo Galilei, but reached an initial fruition in the late 17th century with the work of Isaac Newton and others. The ideas themselves were often revolutionary, transforming scientific understanding in fields as diverse as cosmology, mechanics, chemistry, anatomy, and physiology. Printing, of course, played a crucial role in their transmission, with the publication of a series of major works in various sciences, disseminating them throughout literate Europe. There were also major philosophical innovations which impacted the overall understanding of science, which again achieved a massive impact because they were printed. Although most of these works were in Latin, and so accessible to only a small and well-educated part of the population, it's significant that writers such as Bacon in 1620, Galileo in 1632 and again in 1638, Descartes in 1637 and Newton in 1704 also chose to publish some of their works in their native languages, so reaching an audience beyond that of the highly learned. Vital though the work of these individuals was, however, in terms of the emergence of a public sphere of scientific knowledge, it was the development of a trans-European network of scientists, natural philosophers as they were then termed, rather than the ideas they proposed, which was crucial. This began with webs of correspondence centering on a few individual scientific intelligences who received letters from their circles of contacts, organized and compiled information, and then distributed it to interested parties, sometimes also conveying replies to questions, and so serving as channels for dialogue. This was an enormous task, as evidenced by the many thousands of surviving letters written by these men. Important though the intelligences were in developing an international scientific community, including helping to disseminate the ideas of Galileo and Descartes across Europe, the creation of a genuine public sphere for science was achieved by the scientific societies. The first of these developed in Italy, including, I'm going to translate these into English, the Academy of the Mysteries of Nature in the late 16th century in Naples, and the Academy of the Lynxes in the early 17th century in Rome, but they were small and short-lived. Far more significant were the three national societies that developed in the second half of the 17th century. The Royal Society of London for the Improvement of Natural Knowledge, chartered in 1662, the Académie Royale des Sciences in Paris, which met from 1666, and the Academy of Inquirers into Nature in the German-speaking world, which, although established in 1652, only developed fully later. These began to publish reports of scientific work, notably the Philosophical Transactions of the London Royal Society and the Journal de Chavin, the Journal of the Wise, of the Paris Academy. Although the state-directed French Academy was far more focused on a sustained program of research and accomplishment than the London Society, the more informal London Royal Society probably played the major role in generating scientific debate and camaraderie amongst its widespread international membership. The importance of the Royal Society was accented by the nature of its published transactions, which you'll notice continue to the present day. This set what has become the pattern for the modern world scientific journals, providing a place to publish observations, announce findings, establish priority, and conduct disputes. It reported scientific news from across Europe, including the Society's activities, as well as printing book reviews and letters from members. Through it, the Society's international membership became a virtual community, even if they never or only rarely met face to face. And just to include their famous motto, nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it, very much the spirit of the society. Now let's move on to 17th century debates on economic questions. This was again conducted by a small group of men, in this case mostly merchants and public officials. These arguments about economic questions became particularly common in England. It's possible that this development was due to a unique combination of factors linked both to England's economic position and the relative freedom of public expression, which had come to be accepted as normal. By the early 17th century, England was an increasingly mercantile state, but lagged behind the Dutch Republic in trading success. For many of the English, Holland was both a model to emulate and a competitor to strive against. It was natural, therefore, to ask what were the means by which the Dutch had achieved their success. At the same time, even under the early Stuart kings in the early 17th century, the English took for granted the public expression of contrary views on many matters, not politics or religion, and this relative liberality was greatly increased by the political shifts later in the century, which finally saw a loose association of the two states of England and the Netherlands, or the Dutch Republic I should say, under a common monarch. For my present purposes, it is the fact of these disputes and debates which are important rather than their details. Thus, from the 1620s onwards, there were a succession of printed pamphlets addressing such questions as the regulation of trade, the import of foreign commodities and exportation of precious metal that this entailed, the value of coinage, the supply of precious metals, and the question of recoinage, and the sufferings of the poor at the hands of usurious moneylenders. Such public debate is commonplace in the modern world, but was unusual in the period, where in most countries matters of economic policy were still strictly within the realm of government, that is, not in the public sphere. It is also of note that while some of the earlier pamphlets are clearly partisan defences of special interests, such as those of merchants of the East India Company, those from later in the century were more likely to be sophisticated technical arguments for particular economic policies. So, thank you for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons, Ian Palin and Tricia Williams. You're very welcome to support my channel if you want. Subscribe to be notified of future videos. You can actually support the build-up of the channel through Patreon and PayPal. Again, thank you and have a good day.